Hello and welcome to the 12th episode of the Connect the Dots NYC podcast. In case you're new, I'm your host, Vedant Vohra, and I couldn't be more thrilled to keep this momentum going as we explore bold, creative, and community-driven solutions to homelessness. As a creator of the CTD NYC app, I've seen firsthand how technology can bridge gaps, connecting unhoused individuals in New York City to food, shelter, healthcare, and more. It's a small but powerful example of what happens when innovation meets compassion. On this podcast, we go beyond headlines to highlight the people and ideas transforming how we think about homelessness, from frontline organizers to policymakers, service providers, and those with lived experience. Every conversation is a chance to reimagine what's possible, and today is no exception. Thank you for joining me today, and let's get started. Our guest today is Donald Whitehead. Donald Whitehead is the executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless, the oldest and largest national homeless advocacy organization in the U.S. He's also the co-founder of Racial Equity Partners. With over 25 years of nonprofit leadership, Donald has been at the forefront of efforts to end homelessness and dismantle system inequities. His journey is deeply personal. Having experienced homelessness himself, he's since become a powerful advocate, consultant, motivational speaker, and the author of 2 books, Angels Don't Belong Down Here and Undressing Homelessness. Donald's leadership spans local, state, and national levels, from directing housing programs to testifying before Congress, where he played a role in advancing the Bring America Home Act. His work combines policy expertise, on-the-ground experience, and an unshakable belief in the dignity and rights of all people. Most recently, with the events occurring in our nation's capital, Donald has been interviewed by the likes of MSNBC, CNN, CBS, and more to deliver his opinion on the national stage. Welcome, Donald. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the warm introduction and bio. I really appreciate it.
I want to get started with your early life and the origins of your career. So your journey is extraordinary, going from experiencing homelessness to leading the nation's largest homeless advocacy coalition. Can you share the experiences or turning points that shaped your commitment to this cause?
So, a couple of things. My uh, kind of introduction to this work wasn't when I became homeless myself. It was due to my parents and grandparents. My grandmother was actually one of the 1,000 points of light for George Bush's administration. She ran a food pantry in Hamilton, Ohio. My mother was a kitchen worker who became a assistant teacher and then a social worker, and she worked with kids with mental health disorders. So I watched those two as I grew up. They sometimes brought me to volunteer, interact with some of the other people that were in their programs. So I grew up with a fondness for service, and I actually had a pretty decent level of success myself. So I think I lost it a little bit. I became a little bit selfish and arrogant and just wanted to kind of move on with my career. But then I had a bout with substance abuse that lasted for about 5 years. And it culminated in me becoming homeless. And once I got to the shelter in Cincinnati, I found out that there was a treatment program at the shelter. Um, I had never really tried treatment before, but I got into this program that was really connected to 12-step programs. But also I got to meet my mentor, a gentleman named Buddy Gray, who had founded the National Coalition for the Homeless and the State Coalition in Ohio and the Cincinnati Coalition for the Homeless. And so he took me under his wing and really gave me a glimpse of the underlying causes of homelessness, the structural issues. And once I left the program, and one component of the program, this is incredibly important, was that you had to do community service if you were going to receive services at that facility. And so I volunteered at the Greater Cincinnati Coalition for the Homeless, and I've never left since then.
And you've worked in so many spaces, direct service, program management, policy advocacy, and consulting. How did each of these roles shape your approach to leadership and change making?
It's interesting. I started off in advocacy, which is different than kind of the path for most people. And I certainly had my own experience to rely on. But I realized after in 6 years, I went from sleeping under a bridge to the director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. Probably got there too soon. When I left the coalition, I left because one, there was just this level of frustration at like the inability for Congress to look at this bill that would have ended homelessness, the Bring America Home Act, and just basically ignore it. And that caused me just a great deal of frustration. I was also frustrated by people not being willing to provide resources to end homelessness. But I also realized at that time I needed more of an education in the system itself. So I left the coalition and I went back into direct service. So I did fundraising jobs. I did jobs as a case manager. I also did jobs as the director of programs, sometimes large programs. I directed a shelter with 800 people. I was able to house the 300 hardest to serve individuals in Orlando, Florida. So I also traveled around the country a little bit, just getting a sense of best practices and being able to understand the mechanics of all those practices. Also was enamored with working with people. I mean, some of the people that I've worked with over the years are still in my Rolodex now and call me often for advice and also to cheer me on as I do my work. So those were lasting relationships that I started. So I realized that also there was some skill sharpening I needed to do. I also did technical assistance, helping communities build programs. And then in 2020, I got the call to come back to NTH if I wanted to. And I decided that was the right direction, that I think I had enough of an experience to be able to do the work. And so your original question was, how did all of this help me? Well, understanding the mechanics of a program is important to any advocate, but especially an advocate that's going to work with the federal government on policy development and services. The fundraising jobs that I did really prepared me for, fundraising at a national level. When I got there, I never fundraised at a national level. Done pretty well at the local level, but it's a very different atmosphere and a lot more competition. So those are some of the things I learned. I also learned um, uh, that, along the way, I worked on my recovery and my own personal issues. I learned that, that isn't a competition and that, I don't have to be in front. So I learned a lot of leadership skills as well and a lot of skills that allow me to collaborate.
I also want to focus on storytelling as it's an aspect that's so central to your work as an advocate through fundraising and really in all forms of advocating for the policy changes that you do. And so how has sharing your own story influenced the way others engage with the issue of homelessness?
It's really interesting because I do it in sort of a creative way. Um, I do it in a number of ways, but the one I enjoy the most, part of my background is I'm an actor as well. So I've won an Emmy. I've made 6 movies, done tons of plays, and so what I do is I dress up as I looked when I was homeless, and I tell my story in that costume. And underneath that costume, I have on my suit and tie, which is my normal wear, and so it gives people an understanding that there are stories that are a lot deeper than what you see on the surface, and that homelessness doesn't start when people show up at a shelter, and it gives them hope. I believe that people can actually transform or transcend from homelessness into whatever they want to be, and those possibilities are endless. And so that's what I try to portray through my personal story, but I also try to portray, the idea when I talk about addiction and I talk about mental health, I talk about it as a disease because it is a disease. And, throughout the story, I'm saying my disease is a disease of addiction. But people, have all kinds of other thoughts about what it may be. but it really does connect them to the fact that this is something that we don't have control over as individuals. That those people you see on the street do not have control over something that is a mind and mood altering disease. And so I try to deliver that message as well.
I also want to focus on your path into national advocacy. You've been recently interviewed multiple times with the events going on in our nation's capital, and the path from who you were before to what you are now is so important to your journey. And so, the National Coalition for the Homeless has been active for multiple decades. And when you first stepped in as executive director, what did you see as the most urgent priorities and the most urgent changes?
That's a really interesting question. The most pressing priority for me was resources, and we still have not accomplished that at this point, even after decades of trying. Actually, this is the longest period of homelessness in our history. But what I know for sure is that we've never had the resources to the level of need. So if the country was willing to provide the resources to fund evidence-based programs, we could end homelessness tomorrow. But that has been elusive. Even what's happened in the other three periods of homelessness, this is our fourth period, there's been a large interjection of federal funding, whether it was Medicaid or Medicare, the Social Security Act, the veteran homeless programs. All of those caused a tremendous reduction in poverty and in people suffering from homelessness. We've not seen that. So that was kind of the greatest need. The other thing that I thought was really important was in advocacy, we don't see two groups that are absolutely important that were vital to the civil rights movement. So the traditional civil rights groups, and I won't name any of them, but the groups that you hear talking about the rights of marginalized people, especially people of color, we don't see them in dialogue about this issue. They have tremendous platforms, and it would be so impactful if they were willing to share their experiences and share the need for resources. Black and other people of color in this country are three or four times more likely than their white counterparts to become homeless. And we know that poverty isn't the issue because the levels of poverty are about the same, but the level of homelessness are dramatically increased when you're talking about people of color. And so that group, and the other group is the faith based community. So, here is a community with tremendous resources, both financial resources and space. Most religious bodies use their building twice a week. And, there's so much opportunity for people to do what most religious doctrines say, and that's to care for the poor. And I'm not saying that there's not any that do that, but certainly we don't have enough doing it to make a difference.
And you've worked in both local and national advocacy. And so, how do you balance community specific solutions with trying to enact national level policy change?
I think so. There are a couple of issues that are more locally based than federally based. One in particular, that I'll share with you is the idea that people should be criminalized, that they should be fined, arrested, or jailed. There's no federal policy that says that. Now, the Supreme Court made a decision last year that it was okay to do it, even if you didn't have enough shelter. But those ordinances and laws come from either the state or local community. So it's important that you do both, that you have to work with communities to stand up policy that's going to have the effect of reducing homelessness and sheltering people. Um, and then on a federal level, it's so important that those cities get the resources to do it. The reason why there is, homelessness became a national issue is because local communities found out they couldn't solve it with the limited resources they have. So they needed the federal government to step in and provide additional resources. And now, it seems like we're trying to go back to a number of things that have been proven to be ineffective. Reinstitutionalization is something that's being promoted. Criminalization. The issue with criminalization is that it doesn't solve homelessness. Neither do reinstitutionalization or criminalization do not solve homelessness. If they people are released from either the criminal institution or the mental health institution, they're still homeless at the end of the day.
And you earlier talked about the coalition addressing or trying to address racial equity and how that plays into homelessness as well. I was wondering if you could speak about how you see systemic racism showing up in the crisis and what can be done to address it.
Systemic racism has been an issue for decades. Well, actually, since the founding of this country, if we want to really be precise about history, the first law that created systemic racism leading to homelessness was the Indian Removal Act that removed people from their land, marched them to another part of the country. Thousands of them died along the way. And that was the first forced homelessness and deinstitutionalization in our country. I'm sorry, forced homelessness and racial segregation underlining supremacy in our country. And the other thing that I think is another um, uh, indicator in our history was, of course, chattel slavery. And with that, even after enslaved people were freed, we still had Jim Crow laws. We had a really good opportunity to kind of shut it down with the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War that would have allowed us to the common saying is 3 acres and a mule, but it would have given people that were enslaved that were now free property, which is the number one vehicle for producing wealth in this country. Instead, the politicians basically gave in and allowed segregation, terrorization of people to happen during the period right after the Civil War. And so those are two big things. And then we get to the 30s and we start doing things to help solve homelessness by instituting housing programs like public housing and other programs like the veteran housing was provided for veterans. But unfortunately, people of color and the immigrant population were actually excluded from home sales. You couldn't own a home in most communities through redlining and also separating public housing. There was white public housing, there was black public housing. Redlining caused concentrations of poverty, and it also eliminated the idea of people having insured homes. So they might have been able to access the home, but it wasn't insured. Then we had the Great Migration. The 6 million African Americans moved to cities in the North with hopes that they would find good paying jobs and homes, but they were met with restricted covenants and outright racial segregation and supremacy. And so, fast forward, we had the civil rights movement. Things are moving in the right direction, although we still have restricted covenants in our country right now. And then we have this period and this has always happened. Anytime there's progress by marginalized people, especially people of color, there's a backlash. This is a backlash for Obama's presidency. And since that time, we've seen just a tremendous divide in this country. We've seen more attacks on people experiencing homelessness, more kind of disdain and othering. People are not tolerant anymore when it comes to people experiencing homelessness. And I do believe that's because we now have people of color 3 or 4 times more likely to become homeless. And that's who people see. And so, racism has not gone anywhere in this country. You can still discriminate against who you have in your housing. You can just say, I don't want a Section 8 certificate. Now, on the surface, that doesn't seem like discrimination, but many times it is. People are excluded because of their color. People are excluded because of their family size, their sexual orientation. So we just have a lot of issues that are honestly getting worse in the last few years with the divisiveness that's happening in our country. Pushbacks on things like um, uh, uh, our racial equity work, DEI work is what the word I was trying to look for. And I don't know which one people are not in favor of: diversity, equity, or inclusion. So it became a buzzword, but many people don't know individually what some of those words mean. Affirmative action was pushed back on, although we know that the people that benefited most from affirmative action were white women and not people of color. And so, we also have like a dismantling of history. I mean, that's what happens in authoritative regimes. And it feels like that's where we're headed. But I do see a resistance to that. So, I mean, that was a long answer. I also have a company called Racial Equity Partners. And so we do this work on a regular basis because we know that the work of making things equal and making things equitable in our country, we have a long, long way to go.
No, and I do really appreciate that answer as it helps us contextualize what's happening now. Really with what's been happening for, like you said, since the founding of our nation. And I do want to continue to focus on the current policy and political landscape. Because federal policy can have and is having an enormous impact on homelessness, and sometimes in ways the public doesn't immediately notice. And so, how do you and the coalition work to respond to shifting federal priorities?
It is so interesting because we are so busy right now. Um, what we are doing every day is it's like whack-a-mole. There's some new policy. There's the policies directly affecting people experiencing homelessness, but then there's adjacent policies that just have as much of an effect. So when the bill that was introduced, the really bad bill, not beautiful by any means, um, the majority of people experiencing homelessness are 55 and older, those that live unsheltered. And so, if there is a reduction in Medicaid and other health related programs, it has a direct impact. And the same thing with food stamps. The president introduced his budget, and his budget would cause devastation to this country. I mean, he zeroed out almost every program. They proposed cutting staff, the staff responsible to homelessness, by over 80%. So we already were having trouble getting people into housing. Only a quarter of the people that qualify for housing actually get into that housing. That when it comes to subsidized housing. So if you take away, 80% of the staff and 40% overall, that burden's just going to be so much higher. So the tools that we need to address homelessness and the resources are all being cut at the same time. And, that's just scratching the surface. It's happening in almost every area of this administration. They just cut resources to the Veterans Administration. Now, who deserves services more than the people who have put their lives on the line to save our country? But that doesn't make any difference when it comes to this administration. They're cutting education, the education for homeless children and youth, which is probably the signature accomplishment of the National Coalition. Beyond, we also wrote the McKinney-Vento Act, which provides all the funding. But the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act was a way to go upstream and prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place. So it provided a resource for every student in the school system in America to be able to address homelessness. That's zeroed out. So it provided transportation. Really important that kids stay in the same school, because if they transfer schools, their educational development is reduced by like 3 months, I think is the average. And students who become homeless as children According to the Better Homes Fund, they did a study a couple of decades ago, but it's still relevant today, that those children will become homeless adults. So what we've been trying to do all this time is provide some upstream resources to keep people from getting entangled in the system in the first place. That's being eliminated. Job Corps, which is a program that allows uh, young people to learn valuable skills that they can turn into income and support for them not falling into poverty. They zeroed that out as well. So it is an outright attack on the people at the bottom of the economic ladder in all kinds of ways. And the beneficiary group is people at the top of the economic ladder. So there's always been this idea about trickling down economics. The economics don't trickle down. People just put that money in their pockets. They give it to their investors, but they certainly don't trickle down to people at the bottom of the economic ladder.
And continuing down the same path, what role do you think grassroots organizing plays in influencing national policy, and how can everyday people plug into that process?
Uh, Grassroots organizing is beyond the most important thing that we can do. We've done research, and the research says that the majority of the people who are dealing with homelessness in this country, the majority of the general population, I should say, can be convinced that it's not okay to criminalize people, jail fine, or arrest people, that there are other solutions. So the only way we get to those people is through grassroots organizing. And it has been the recipe for victory in movements throughout our country. And some people shy away from it. Some people are afraid right now and not interested. So there are a million different things. If it's supporting just through donations to organizations, much of our funding is under attack right now. So any small amount helps organizations like the National Coalition and some of those that are on the front lines, like the Ward 7 Mutual Aid Society in DC. They could use money because they're actually putting people in hotels and providing blankets for people. So that is one way. But also join in our petition drives and our sign on letters, call your representative, show up to town halls. All of those things are things that you can do. Convince your congregation to get involved in advocacy. There's volunteer opportunities at many organizations. So there are a plethora of ways that people can get involved. You just have to have the will to do it. But grassroots organizing, we're going to be doing more and more. We're trying to get out in front of what is potentially going to be a set of detention centers around the country for people experiencing homelessness. And to tie it all together, some of the biggest contributors to the campaign for our current president were from the private prison industry. They had tremendous cutbacks in their funding under the Biden administration. They gave a lot of money to Trump administration, and people that do that expect rewards. And I think we're headed down a path of getting those people rewards.
And I want to ask you just to elaborate a bit more, because my question lies in the fact that I want to learn about what is missing, because I was recently lucky enough to interview Dr. Sam Semberis, who created Housing First,
Good
and
friend of mine.
and they've been he's done research where there have been 80% that have stayed within housing versus like 40%, which was traditional shelter-based housing. And so if we have this evidence-backed research and we have this sort of emotional outcry against what is happening, just because it's so devastating to see people's lives swept up in bulldozers, what is missing from changing the narrative and the story that is in the public eye right now to really push and make that final step to give people the lives and rights that they truly need?
So I think the missing step is compassion. And understanding by really our elected officials, mostly because they're the ones responsible for the resources. The general public and our elected officials need to understand that this is not a moral issue. I'm sorry. It's a structural and a financial issue. People are not homeless because they want to be. They're homeless because the conditions on the ground, and I mean our economy, the housing costs in this country, the long stagnant minimum wage, all of those things are forcing people. Domestic violence. There's a whole lot of things, and even with mental health and substance abuse, it's not the individual's issue. The issue is that we don't have enough resources for them to get services for either of those issues. So our society is not providing the resources necessary, but it's a lot easier to blame individuals than it is the willingness by our federal government to address these issues head on. And so they have over and over again provided enough resources that pits populations against each other, that makes us choose like the community du jour. You know, which is it? Youth? Is it veterans? Is it people with mental health issues? You can only choose one because there's not enough resources for everybody. And then we have not. The other recipe is upstream prevention. We do a good job once people get in the system, but every day 19,000 more people show up every week, I should say. So we empty out the shelters and 19,000 people show up the next week. We got to shut that off. We got to figure out how we can provide upstream resources to address that issue.
And when we talk about resolving, not individual issues, but really systemic and trying to make systemic change, what it really comes down to is unity and making sure everyone is on the same page and that we have this whole unifying force that is the, United States of America. And so my question is, how can leaders, even those outside of the homelessness sector, use their influence to create meaningful change that will help the coalition and other sorts of organizations really, make that final push and make systemic change.
Yeah, I think there's so much we have to do. And I think that it's going to have to go beyond those that get paid to do this work. It's going to be the recipe is similar to the civil rights movement. We have to get faith-based leaders involved and everyday people that just say we're not going to stand for this anymore. You know, we are the richest country in the history of the world, and people are dying on park benches and in grassy fields, and people are being victimized in those places, and people just have to stand up. Um, I think even in this time, the people that stand up or that are standing up in DC are those that always do that. So, the other thing that's missing is students. We need students to have the same level of energy for this issue as they do with other issues. Students probably decided this election, so we need students to decide this issue as well.
And looking forward a bit, if you could wave a magic wand to create one cultural shift tomorrow that would make ending homelessness possible, what would it be and why?
It would be to see communities use the available resources like abandoned buildings, which are a lot easier to develop, a lot quicker to develop, and are a lot more cost effective. So the answer is right in front of people's eyes. We have, hundreds of buildings in every downtown area, tens of thousands of buildings in every state, and millions of buildings around this country that we could utilize for people that are in need of housing. We have a 7 million house gap in our country, and we have to make sure that we address that. So if I had a magic wand, I would put in people's minds that we have to get these buildings that are abandoned, that are structurally sound, back on back in order, and get these to move ahead effectively.
And I mean, throughout this interview, we've thrown around statistics like, 19,000 people entering the system every week, which is like over 2,500 a day. And that brings the connotation around this, interview topic and what's happening to be, slightly sad and in that nature. It is true because what is going on is obviously not what we want to happen. But what gives you hope right now in this movement that, what will happen, we will like overcome this and we will continue to eventually and inevitably end homelessness.
Well, I think, just looking at this week, the amount of mainstream exposure that this issue got this week, even in just the interviews that I did, but I know many other interviews happened with other people within the movement. That's not typical. People don't have the same level of concern about this issue enough to invite people to these mainstream shows. So I'm hoping that this wakes people up. So I have a glimmer of hope that what I'm seeing in DC is kind of people coming together in unity and resisting in any way they can. And so I'm hoping that this awakens others around the country, and also those that are in kind of the bullseye right now. I hope those are awakened. People are awakened as well.
And I always like to end these interviews by trying to see what my viewers and everyone else can do. And so for those listening, whether they're students, advocates, community members, or just any person part of society, what's one thing that they can do today to help us move closer to that goal?
Now I'm going to be selfish because there is a huge need because we have to not only work on what's happening in D.C. but also Oakland and Detroit and Los Angeles because these were other communities that were named Baltimore and Chicago. So we need resources to do that. So I'm going to give you two things. Please support the National Coalition for the Homeless. We're a small group. We feel like we're mighty but small. And so if you go to www.nationalhomeless.org, you can make a contribution. And our contributions go out not only to us, but we have a network. We have field offices around the country that we help to support. We're the main support for them. The other thing you can do is write to your elected official. Right now, we're going to be sending out a sign-on letter today, and we're hoping that people will sign on to it because it's going directly to the president. But you have local officials, as I said, criminalization and the lack of housing. Those are things that can be solved in your community with resources from the federal government, but it has to start with the direction and the mandate from your local community. So write to your local elected officials and let them know that you can't solve homelessness with crime. Nobody has ever been able to pay their rent because of a threat of arrest. No one has not gone unscathed once they're incarcerated. So we need your help to prevent that from happening to people. Just because you have a medical issue, a mental health issue, or a substance abuse issue, you shouldn't be subject to arrest. Not in this country. That's not who we are. And we need you to say that to your elected officials.
Well, our hearts, our thoughts, and our prayers go out to those in the unhoused community, especially those in DC who are really at the hotbed of what's going on. I want to say thank you, Mr. Whitehead, for taking your time for being with me today and spreading the message and just sharing your expertise, experience, and what's needed to really stop this.
Thank you so much. And really appreciate the opportunity for being on with you. And thank you for what you're doing. This is amazing. And keep sharing. And hopefully you bring some people into the fold because we need every hand on deck that we can get.